Our next presenter always knew they wanted to be a speaker and writer when they grew up. They just thought they would be on the pro-Islam side of things.
Their blog, Heinous Dealings, is one of 4 total free thought blogs belonging to ex-Muslim women.
They keep their activism fresh and intersectional by going to at least 2 geeky cons a year.
Please welcome to the stage, Heina Dadabhoy.
Alrighty, good to be back at year 2 of Sexy Secular Con. Last year was fantastic. This year I think is going to be about the same. To relate back to the prior talk, I'm just going to warn you that, they're the atheists next door. I'm the angry, unrelatable atheist. Just to warn you. Because, we have diversity in our atheist community, right? Some of us, there's space for some of us to be a little curmudgeonly, I like to think. So I picked this talk and this title because there is this sense with a lot of people that the idea of being LGBT or queer or any of those things and being Muslim or hailing from the Islamic world, people laugh. I'll bring it up. I'll be like, oh, there's like a queer Muslim group. And people are like, ha, that exists? Really? I thought they just killed them all. So there's this sense of like a lack of understanding of the current and the past realities of LGBT and Islam's intersections. And it's really interesting to me because as someone who has sort of looked at the history of this for fairly self-serving reasons, granted, I don't blame anyone for not knowing about this, but if you read older Orientalist texts that describe the Islamic world, as they call it, the Middle East and Africa and parts of Asia, you find that the Western view of the Islamic parts of the world was not that they were anti-LGBT or that LGBT people did not exist there, but quite the opposite, that these brown people were all depraved and they were all secretly all banging each other constantly. Seriously, like if you read the older translations of the Arabian Nights, the Arabian Nights is sexy. There is a lot of sex going on there. But there's this perception that Westerners had in their Orientalist texts, if you read them, that, everyone was too sexy. And now it's sort of, there's for a fact. It's sort of inverted into this idea that they're not sexual at all and that it's anti-sex. And you see that same exact change in perceptions with Asian people in the United States. If you look at the early accounts of Chinese immigrants to the United States, the men were portrayed as these sexual deviants and predators who were going to spoil all of white womanhood with their evil, Asian desires. And now it's the opposite. The Asian male in American society is stereotyped as sexless instead of sexy. So you see that same change. And it's amazing, throughout history, the way stereotypes have shifted. I'd also like to remind ourselves that it wasn't that long ago that the United States had laws on the books against quote-unquote sodomy. That's a very recent history where that's changed. Granted, it hasn't been enforced in quite a while, but it's not like Western society has always been the way we perceive it to be now. In addition, the DSM used to consider homosexual attractions or behaviors to be a disease, to be a problem, to be a psychological problem to be dealt with. Freud was all about that. Freud thought that, there was something wrong with people. And I actually found this book not long ago. It was in the free pile at the library, so you knew it was going to be promising. And it was called Homosexuality, and it was this green book, and it smelled musty and horrible, and it was from the 40s or something. And I was flipping through it, and gosh, it was terrible. And these attitudes, they're not dead yet. They're dying off. They're slowly being eroded, but they're still kind of there. So we have to keep in mind that, as much as we like to look at other cultures and say, oh, they're not as progressive as we are, we may not be as progressive as we think too, and that's something worth examining. So within Islamic cultures, just like within other cultures, even though there might have been laws on the books or religious edicts against, being queer in any way, we still have records of it happening because since when did laws and edicts ever stop people from doing what they wanted? Sometimes it prevents you from being open about it, but generally people are going to do what people are going to do. The records we have of it come from the most rich and powerful in society. So we don't have a lot of records of maybe everyday people who might have been flying under the radar, or under the gaydar, as it might have been. We have records from, the very rich who had their sort of decadent, sumptuous lifestyles of complete debauchery. And then we have rich people's accounts of people who they discovered to be, outside of the norm and were punished for it. So we have the sexploits of the rich and the powerful punishing people who are more oppressed for that. In Muhammad's time, to get it back to Islam, really, if you look at the Quran itself, it's kind of like the Old Testament, where the obsession is not so much with homosexuality or any sort of quote-unquote deviant behaviors, but really more about controlling women. We all know those Abrahamic faiths love controlling women. They're really, really worried about paternity. They really don't want women to have babies that aren't the direct biological descendants of their husbands or their masters, because slavery was a thing. So, you have this obsession with controlling women's bodies and uteruses, essentially. So there's not a whole lot about homosexuality. It's kind of like the Old Testament in that way. But there are verses of the Quran that people will say are against homosexuality. And this is the story of Lut, which in the Old Testament, as you might have guessed it already, is Lot. The Sodom and Gomorrah stories. The idea that, there are these debauched cities where just men are constantly having sex with each other, and they're so depraved that even when angels show up to their city, they want to bang them. It's this whole idea. But in the Quran itself, there's not a huge reference to, a direct reference to it. It's really more lust or lewdness. It's this fixation on they give in to their lusts and they are not in control of themselves. And because of that slight ambivalence, everyone's always looking for a loophole, right? There you see this sort of diversity in interpretations about what is or isn't okay within Islam in terms of not being straight. Muhammad, though, the sayings of Muhammad are a lot less ambivalent. Mostly, the ones that are recorded are prescribing strong punishments and condemnation. So there's no doubt that that's there, just not in the Quran necessarily. I've heard things like, Muhammad saying that you have to throw the person from the highest tower if you catch them in a non-heterosexual act. Or cast them from the tallest mountain. That is the one I heard growing up. And I still remember when my mother first told me that in Islam, gay people should be cast from the highest mountain. I had just learned about Mount Olympus on Mars. And so I thought, man, do we have to start a space program? Because it has to be the tallest mountain, right? It's silly in hindsight, obviously, but it's kind of sad in a lot of ways. There is a saying of Muhammad, allegedly, where he acknowledges that men who like men exist, but to him, that was their test in life. And that was the interpretation that I went with when I was a Muslim, the idea that it's not good to be gay, but some people are born that way, and so they have to stay celibate their whole lives, and that's their test in life, and in the afterlife, it'll be fine. It'll all work out. A lot of the condemnations of same-sex sexual activity in Islam are really based on the idea of adultery more than anything. Because there's no such thing as same-sex marriage in Islam, any same-sex activity you do is by definition outside of marriage. And for women especially in Islam, being outside of having sexual relations outside of marriage is really, really condemned. And adultery in Islam actually is not defined as, being married and cheating on your spouse. It's being defined as having sex with someone who you're not legally allowed to have sex with, according to Islamic law. So men are allowed to have sex with non-Muslim women, slaves, concubines, up to 4 wives. Women, you can only have sex with your husband. So obviously a lot more opportunities or potential for adultery for women than for men. Funny how that always works out when you have religions like that. But, again, historically, It's not like those laws ever stopped anybody, especially in the case of men, at least that we know of. Because even though male sexuality isn't necessarily encouraged by religion, when a religion like Islam gives a lot of power to men, what do the powerful do? They exercise their power, they flex their muscles. And so when that power and freedom is granted both by religion and the society you're in, who wouldn't take advantage of it? And so they did. There is a huge historical tradition of what you might call pederasty, if you were being polite, or buggery, if you weren't being polite. The idea, just like with the ancient Greeks, where, you would have a man who was powerful and he'd have his wife for procreative purposes, and he would keep her in their household and keep her away from the public view. And then, for fun, go with young men or boys, essentially. Oscar Wilde did it too. People say that he was gay, but it's pretty well recorded that he had affairs with women and definitely had sex with his wife. He just also had sex with young boys. That tradition actually lives on in Afghanistan and other places, but I'll get to that when I discuss the modern implications. To take it back a little, in Persia, now known as Iran, there is a strong tradition of poems about wine and beautiful boys. Lots and lots and lots of ancient poetry, which would make you think, oh, when Ahmadinejad said there are no gays in Iran, he was probably wrong. But he was right in a way, because these poems weren't about being gay. They weren't about having a monosexual sexual orientation where you only go for men or boys and you commit your life to another man or a boy. But rather where you're married and you go through the normal societal heterosexist structure, and then on the side you go off and, have sex with boys or girls or whoever you prefer. So that's kind of what's going on with there. When it comes to women and female homosexual activity within Islamic history, it's very similar to Western patriarchal society. It's cis-sexist and it's heterosexist in the view that if a man with a penis is not inserting his penis into an orifice, no sex has occurred. Like, in order to do a sex, there must be a man with an erect penis going into either an anus or a vagina. Everything else is just whatever. It's the everything but rule, right? So when it comes to female-female relations within Islamic history, they were sort of dismissed as, oh, the girls are just being girls. You still see this attitude now. I kissed a girl and I like it. I hope my boyfriend don't mind it. The idea that it doesn't really count because it's just a girl. Doesn't matter. So that kind of happened with in the Islamic world as well. Part of the problem, too, is that female sexual desire is not addressed at all within Islam itself. Male sexual desire, oh yeah, all over the place. You got to cover up the women so the men don't get aroused. But women, it's really more about worrying about their uteruses and what babies they're carrying. That's what they're worried about. That allowed for a lot of, freedom within a very limited context. There are definitely a lot of insinuations about, in the women's only parts of houses of, women sleeping with each other, touching each other, things like that. Also about the harem guards who were always eunuchs, and eunuchs are men who have been castrated. But castration can happen in multiple ways. It can be entire removal of the penis and the scrotum and the testicles, or it can just be removal of the testicles and the penis can still become erect, but unable to impregnate anybody. So there are some sort of vague historical records that suggest that these women were banging their eunuchs, because they wouldn't get in trouble for it. To go back to the Arabian Nights both revered and feared women who were who had high sexual appetites. So the female libido is discussed in the fiction from the Arab world, not so much in Islam. But in the fiction, it's there. And so there's this fear of this woman's gonna just be all promiscuous and sleep with everybody and be like a succubus. But there was also this veneration of oh wow, a lusty woman, who wouldn't like that? And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. An early version of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew can be found in the original Arabian Nights. This sort of juxtaposition of the fear and the desire for a woman who has a good libido. So to take it into the modern world, a lot of modern anti-LGBT sentiment in the Islamic world is, to some extent, a backlash against what they see as Western cultural imperialism. So the idea is that, like what Ahmadinejad said, we don't have gays here in Iran. The idea of, saying no to the traditional marriage and children thing in favor of someone of the same sex, to them is abhorrent. Why would you do that? Do what you want in your spare time. Just make sure you put in your dues as a family person. That's the idea. Of course, you can't attribute all of the homophobia to Western backlash, but it doesn't help by any means. In Afghanistan, they still do the whole pederasty thing. They call it bachabazi, which very euphemistically means like playing with children. And you notice in the Western context, we discuss child marriage a lot. We point to the Islamic world and say, oh, these people are marrying 12-year-old girls, it's so disgusting. There is a lot of I think, sexism in that we, look at girls and go, oh, the poor innocent girl, she's being violated. There's not a lot of discussion of the pederasty that goes on, which, happens with boys about as young, if not younger, than these child brides. So it's a major problem. To move on from Afghanistan to Iran, in Iran, there's this phenomenon where if you're a gay man, if you're a man who has relationships with other men, they decide that you are not actually a man, you are a woman. Because in order for you to be attracted to men, you must be a woman and not a man. And so essentially, gay men are forced to transition. The government pays for it, they encourage it, they basically have them, they don't really have them go through therapy and take hormones like in other countries. They just send them into the surgeon and they get genital surgery. And then they walk out, they're like, all right, you're a woman now you can get married to a man. And this has become a major problem because a lot of these people are not trans. Trans is a completely separate, not separate, but it's a gender identity, not a sexual identity. But yeah, there's a lot of men there who were forced to genitally transition in order to be accepted by society. Moving on to the Western world and Islamic or Muslim people within it. In England, I was surprised to discover this. It's a very recent thing. There are Christian-style ex-gay groups. There is a Muslim one now, where they try to get men to retrain their desires and be with women. In the United States, things are a little bit different. I still remember I was probably, 13 years old. My cousin comes to me, and she had just started at university, and she said, Heina, I have to tell you about something. I just can't believe it. I said, what? She said, there's this group of men, okay, and they fast, and they pray, and, they give charity, and they go to Hajj, and they're gay. And I remember thinking, how is that possible? But there is a group that has existed since the 90s, and this is the group she was alluding to, called Al-Fatiha. And originally it started out as a gay men's group, and now it's expanded to other identities. But they were the first in the United States to be a big organization in favor of Muslims who were not straight. And to go back to the Quran, people who are on that side of things will argue that, the Quran discusses homosexual lust or desire. It doesn't address love or relationships between people of the same sex. So that's their view. I heard about it when I was 13 or 14, and I was shocked. But within a year, I had done my research on it, as I tended to do, and I realized that my views on LGBT issues were not quite what my family's were. I thought, all right, as a Muslim, I would not do that. I would not, be in a relationship with a woman. That's not okay. I would, refrain from such things. But for people who are not Muslim, I thought they had no reason to refrain from it. So in my view, as long as it wasn't someone who was calling themselves a Muslim who were doing it, they were fine. And I, in fact, participated in the Gay Straight Alliance's Day of Silence as a Muslim girl in a headscarf. And later, I realized that my sympathies and my views probably had to do with the fact of my own identity. I found out it wasn't normal to say, all right, I definitely won't have a relationship or sex with a woman because I'm a Muslim. For straight people, they just don't want to. That's just not something that crosses their minds. And it's like, oh, well, okay. And I ended up, figuring out that I'm fairly queer as far as it goes. And that's where I think, this idea of like children are innocent is kind of silly, because I probably had my first thought about a woman when I was, 8 or 9. And it wasn't necessarily sexual, but it was definitely erotic and sensual. So that's kind of how it goes. And to go back to the intro, to bring up another part of my identity, I consider myself to be gender questioning, and I was so glad you all caught that and used they as my pronoun. That's my preferred pronoun. I don't police the pronoun, but that's where I'm at right now, so yay. I've come quite a far ways from being a scarf-wearing Muslim girl. To return to the non-Western Islamic world, there's something interesting that I found out recently, and that was that in certain parts of the Middle East and Africa, the idea is that, if you're a man, having sex with younger men and boys, being the giver rather than the receiver, is sort of a manly, macho thing to do. And this is true in the Western world, too. But part of why they discourage men from being the receivers of anal sex is the idea that anal sex is so great you will become addicted to it. And that's the idea of like, okay, if you're, above the age of, let's say, 15 or 16, you have to stop getting buggered, because otherwise you're just never going to want to have sex with a woman, in the vagina anyway. So that's the attitude over there with that. Looking forward, Al-Fatiha isn't the only queer Muslim group anymore. There are many, many groups. There are many, many progressive-oriented Muslim organizations and movements that are pro-LGBT. There was the open mosque that opened in South Africa not long ago and also closed down almost as quickly, although not for the reasons that I thought it was. It considered itself an open mosque. It was started by a man who said it would be open to women. Women wouldn't have to pray in the back. Queer people would be allowed, all that. As it turns out, a lot of progressives within the Islamic community were pissed at him, not for being open, but for completely denigrating the accomplishments that they have done within Islam in the past 10 years or more. Because he was claiming, I am the first Muslim to do such a thing. And there actually have been female-led queer and feminist spaces within Islam for a long time now. And by saying, oh, I'm the first person to do this, he was essentially saying, you guys don't count. I'm the straight male, and I've decided that I'm the first to do this, even though he wasn't. So that was the issue with the open mosque, too. There's a lot of criticism of it from, both the conservative and the progressive side of Muslims. But at least it was something. It was a thing that happened. There's also the Hidden Voices Project, which you can look up online. It's a photography project. I think it's mostly based out of Canada. And it's pictures of queer Muslims, and they tell their stories. There are Pride Parade participation all over the place. I've seen many pictures online, pictures that I wasn't even necessarily looking for, just happened to stumble across, of, trans women who are Muslim participating in Pride Parades, holding up signs saying trans Muslim proud. There's a general move in Islam right now towards reform. It's slow, it's arduous, it's not as fast as we want it to be, but it's happening. In addition, I have found out through my contacts with the Muslims that I used to know or are related to me, that a lot of Western Muslims, their focus is not opposing LGBT people. Their focus is eliminating the racism that they face on a daily basis. So, for example, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a group that works for the civil rights of Muslims, partners with the ACLU constantly. And I don't think many Muslim groups came out against same-sex marriage. Like, there's a couple that have issued statements, but for the most part, they've stayed quiet about it because their view is that that shouldn't be our focus, and we probably shouldn't be participating in what is essentially minority persecution when we're a minority too. There's also an issue that I think is going to become more and more pertinent as time goes on, and this is confronting the difference between in-group and out-group within Muslim communities. Think back to when I was a Muslim and I thought, it's okay to be gay, but just don't do it. And if you do it, just make sure you're not a Muslim. This attitude is pretty common among Western Muslims, especially in America now. Where before, if a gay person even came up in conversation, people would say, let's beg Allah for forgiveness and move on. Now the idea is, okay, it's okay for those people. But that becomes a problem when you look at Muslim communities and queer people who exist within them. The fact is that there are people who are, they're gay and they're white and they're not within the Islamic community, able to do interfaith work without a problem with Muslims, but unfortunately, you don't see queer Muslims being included because it's easier for people within the Muslim community to say, outsiders can do this thing we don't approve of, but insiders, no. Which is why, my parents do have Google. They could look if they wanted, I guess. I'm still not officially out to them about a lot of this, but it's a don't ask, don't tell situation. So that's something that I think is going to be confronted more and more as time goes on. So what is the takeaway from all of this? It's important to contextualize our understanding of global human history when we think about LGBT and queer issues. So, think about how we are in our both recent past and our present and the distant past, and the effects that these pasts have on each other and these narratives have on each other. It's important to look at the difference between de facto and de jure. So where, within Islam, de jure, by law, queerness is not allowed, but it happens anyway, de facto. In Western society, we're moving more towards a de jure, it's okay to be gay, or trans or whatever, but de facto, in reality, it's not always so great to be outside of the cis-sexist, heterosexist paradigm. So it's important to consider those factors as well. And there is a balance that we have to strike, and I'm still working on this myself, between erasure and over-optimism. So what erasure says is, no, there aren't queer Muslims because that's not allowed in Islam. That's erasing the experiences of people who are Muslim and who are LGBT. So we have to acknowledge that they exist. At the same time, we can't be overly optimistic and say, oh yeah, most Muslims are totally cool with it. If their kid came out to them, they'd be fine with it. Probably not. So we can accept that most Muslims don't accept queerness and most Muslims are not queer, but that people who accept it and are even part of it do exist. That's called nuance. It's hard. I know it's hard. Take it from an angry atheist. Nuance about religion is really hard. But I think it's really important to do it anyway, because the only way to really lead to a better world is to consider things sort of as reasonably, realistically, and carefully as possible. And my personal engagement and tactic these days is to promote, without being over-optimistic about it, the more progressive voices within Islam and to say, reform can happen. I'd rather we drop it all and just move on. That's never going to happen, though. Realistically speaking, that's not going to happen. It hasn't even happened in the Western world. If you look at the United States, we're incredibly religious as a whole. But we can let go of these rules that are oppressive towards people and groups. And I think that the Muslim world is capable of this too. It's just going to take a little while. All right. I think we have a lot of time for questions, decent amount of time. That's what I was hoping for. And I will prioritize answering questions about specifically LGBT issues in Islam, but if you have general questions about Islam, that's okay too. I just would rather you sort of wait and see if other people have questions that are more specific. That's fair, I think. All right. Yes?
That saying about throw the gays off the highest mountain, is that in the Quran or is that in the Hadith?
That's in the Hadith. There is no prescription for punishment for people who are caught in the act of same-sex sex. That's an awkward phrase. It's men, actually. Men, if you catch two men having sex, then you throw them off the highest mountain. That's a Hadith thing. Yeah, there's no punishment for being gay in the Quran. There is the obvious implication of, if you have sex outside of marriage, you're condemned. There's that. And then there's, the condemning of the people of Lut, who had their entire city destroyed and all that stuff. But yeah, no direct punishment in the Quran, just in the Hadith. Which, by the way, I didn't get into this, but the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, are always being argued about within Islam. Which one is accurate? Which one was related by someone who's trustworthy? Was this person full of crap and we're accepting their word? Was Muhammad being literal or figurative? As much as arguments as they are about the interpretation of the Quran, it's even worse with the Hadith, if you can believe it. All right, I think there's other hands. Yes, lots of other hands. Yes, you.
What would you say are the most common myths or misunderstandings that circulate among atheists about Islam, sex, or perhaps in general?
Ooh, that's another talk I did kind of last year. So yeah, watch my talk from last year. Also, read my blog. Also, read my book. Well, no, I can, huh?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was, what are some of the biggest misconceptions among atheists about Muslims in general, especially Islam and sexuality? I would say the biggest one is the idea that, because Islam has all these laws around sex and sexuality, then no Muslim has ever broken them. There's this idea of like Muslims, they must follow their book literally. You know what? There's plenty of laws in Christianity against all kinds of sexy stuff, and Christians do it anyway. That's kind of human nature. Yeah, and I guess to go back to the erasure thing, that's probably the biggest thing. As an ex-Muslim running around in atheist circles, and, I'll mention a queer Muslim group, and like I said at the beginning, people will just laugh, like, haha, that couldn't exist. So, it's sort of this patronizing approach of like, oh, you guys are those people, and those people are so weird, and they don't accept anybody. And, that's not true, and I think it's important to encourage the understanding of this and to push it a little bit even, because that's what's going to lead to a better world in general, I think. Yes?
With historically younger generations being more progressive, open-minded across the board, are there any signs in Muslim communities that the youth, perhaps in universities, are more forward-thinking with less rigidity on some of these issues?
So the question was, as we see with non-Muslim groups, there's a progressiveness that happens with age, where a younger generation is more open, whereas the older generation is a little more closed off, and if that's happening with Muslims. We don't really have statistics on that, so I can't speak statistically, but I would say that there's definitely less of an innate sort of sense of revulsion, at least. There's not an instant like, oh, that person's gay, can't touch them, can't talk about them, can't look at them, otherwise I might get infected. There's more nuance going on. There's more understanding going on. But yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily quite acceptance yet. But you do see more movement towards more progressive views. So hopefully that'll continue. Yes?
For yourself personally, was discovering that you were queer and becoming an ex-Muslim, were those like related processes? Or?
That's a really good question. They actually were not. I was pretty... Oh, I'm sorry. The question was discovering that I no longer believed in Islam, that I became an ex-Muslim, and discovering that I'm queer, if those processes were related. For me, they were not. I was oddly resigned to the rules of Islam when I was a Muslim. So even though I knew, I didn't really realize what they were, but I did have romantic and sexual feelings about women and men. But, I consider that to be in the same boat as, a desire to have a cool hairstyle. That's not allowed in my religion, so I don't do that. So I was kind of resigned to living by the rules of Islam. Deconversion was really an intellectual, philosophical process for me. So I was a scarf-wearing, heavily practicing Muslim girl, and 6 months of extreme doubt later, I was an atheist in a headscarf because I didn't really know what to do with myself. What do you do when you have your whole life surrounding religion and suddenly, oh, I'm an atheist? Well, what now? How do I start being a normal person, or a non-Muslim, as it were? So, yeah, the discovery and understanding of my queerness, I definitely, though, after I left Islam and realized I didn't need to follow the rules of Islam anymore, I definitely had that moment where I'm like, I'm going to have to face this whole I like ladies thing. But I decided that I would deal with my heterosexual side first. So I figured out how to do the whole dating and having sex with men thing, and then for a little bit, and then I was like, okay, then maybe I can think about this lady thing. And, And as I was doing that, again, like I had that inkling of like, oh, I don't know about my gender identity either. But I remember thinking, one thing at a time. I deconverted at 18. It's been 8 years. I have plenty of time to deal with all of this. Especially since, it's not like I was a lesbian, or it's not like I'm a trans man. So both my gender and sexual identities are fluid and non-binary. So when you're not binary, you can sort of walk that line and not have to deal with as much oppression or subjugation. Privilege, that's the word they use these days, right? I'll admit it. Anybody else? Yes?
You said that you wore a headscarf while you were...
Oh, yeah.
Where do you stand in the debate about practices like that? Either they can be like oppressive or they can be empowering, like I heard.
I thought it was empowering because I grew up in Southern California where, women are basically slaves to their looks. Starving yourself, exercising to the point of, complete exhaustion, wearing, looking perfect for bikini season, having perfectly long, straight hair, having the perfect look and body, as it were. That seemed like an imprisonment and slavery to me. And so, I was this fat kid in a headscarf, and I'm like, I don't have to care about all this crap. I can do what I want. It's great. It's liberating. I'm free. I'm not enslaved to the straightening iron and the gym. But, that was my context. In other contexts, in countries where you are socially or legally forced to wear a headscarf, of course it's a tool of oppression. It really just depends on where you're at. So for me, the answer to that question is it really depends. If the woman is choosing to wear it and she feels it's her form of expressing herself and empowerment, I'm not going to argue with her about it. You have articles coming up all the time on the Huffington Post about a woman who says, I never used to shave my mons, but I shaved it, and that was a feminist act. And I'm like, what? Since when did everything a woman ever did become a feminist act? So if, shaving your mons to please your boyfriend can be a feminist act, wearing a headscarf, come on, that could be a feminist act too. If we're really going to go that way. But, sarcasm aside, though, for me, it was an empowering act. And dealing with body image after leaving Islam was tough, and I'm still dealing with it. I wouldn't presume to tell any woman that her headscarf is oppressive unless she is actually being forced to wear it. Of course, I am leaving out the part where you're taught that you might suffer in hell if you don't wear it. So that is a form of pressure too. But hell is also other people. If you're not, if you don't look a certain way and you live in certain areas, people can make your life fairly hellish sometimes. Yes.
So my question is about progressiveness in the Muslim world, in different countries. If you're gay or whatever. Do you find or do you know of any other countries that are a little bit more lenient with the rules? Like they find that you're gay, are they just going to stone you, or are they going to just shame you and kind of ostracize you?
The question is, the differences in levels of progressiveness on LGBT issues in different Islamic countries. Oddly enough, the Wikipedia article breaks down the laws really well. There's actually, homosexuality is not illegal in a lot of Muslim countries. Way fewer of them than I thought, even. When I first stumbled across it, I said, oh, it's not actually illegal in places I thought it would be illegal. But the social pressure is there. It's the same way that it happens with immigrant communities in the United States. Just don't let your parents find out. Only tell certain people, sneak around, get married and have children, but do stuff on the side anyway. But the social pressure there is immense. And sometimes, families will enact what they consider to be the proper religious penalty. So if families discover that their child was, sneaking around and seeing people of the same gender, there have been cases where they will kill their child. That has happened. And often the countries, even where that's not, where it's not illegal to be gay, they'll look the other way when stuff like that happens because they consider it to be a family honor matter and they'll leave it alone. So there's a lot of that weird, depends on your family thing in a lot of countries. Yes.
I noticed during your talk, on the one hand you said if you're having homosexual sex, two men having homosexual sex, you're thrown from the highest mountain.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other mutually pleasurable thing,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll get addicted to it, so you have to stop doing it. Now, I'm more familiar with Christianity, and there's this idea of kind of repressing your desires and not self-indulging, and if you indulge in all these pleasures, that's sinful. Is there kind of this idea of self-denial in Islam as well?
So the question had to do with, the contrast between the idea that being buggered is so great and you're going to become addicted, and in contrast to the idea of, being thrown off the highest mountain for being gay, and how in Christianity there's this focus on self-deprivation and denial of pleasure. That's definitely there. The idea is that, there's a verse in the Quran that, there's that wealth and women, of course women, because women don't read the Quran, right? This is all about men. Wealth and women are the decorations of the world, and don't be dazzled by it, essentially. Don't become enamored with this world. You're merely a traveler waiting for the afterlife. So there's, I would say from the strong afterlife perspective, there is this idea that you should deprive yourself because the better pleasures are waiting for you in heaven anyway. All right. I think I saw other hands at some point. Yes. The question has to do with the Islamic State and, what we should do about it. I am completely unqualified to answer this question. I've been following the ISIS thing and the ISI, all these initialisms. I follow global politics, especially when it has to do with Islam for obvious reasons. But I'm not a scholar on the political situations of those countries. Thankfully there are Muslims who are also fighting against it, so yay. That's the best I have. I'm sorry. Yes?
Are there any trends right now in Islam that give you some sense of optimism, if not now or for the future?
Trends that give me optimism within Islam. Definitely the focus on intra-Muslim community dynamics. Like there's definitely this idea that, all right, we need to stop worrying about condemning people outside of the Muslim community and clean our own house. That's always a good thing. It's what I encourage with atheist communities too. Clean up your own damn house. And that's happening with Islam to some extent. In addition, if you look at the history of religions, and this is a little bit linear and reductive, but I'm going to roll with it anyway. The idea is that once you have people leaving the religion in amounts enough to be noticed and who are vocal about it, generally that leads to that religion reforming. You saw that with Catholicism when Protestantism happened and they split off and they're like, okay, we gotta fix up Catholicism a little bit. You see that happening with Islam because of ex-Muslims. So I'm part of this, obviously, but there's, organizations popping up. We have our own stuff going on. There's an ex-Muslims blog network. There are forums. The subreddit is incredible, the ex-Muslim subreddit. And Muslims can't pretend like we don't exist or that we're all Zionist agents or that we're all... No, I'm not kidding you. I still at least once a month get someone on Twitter telling me that I've been bought and paid for by the Zionist conspiracy. In which case, where's my damn check? Why am I eating peanut butter for lunch? What's happening? But yeah, they can't do that anymore. There's too many of us from all over the world for them to say that it's all just one confused person or whatever. They can't ignore us. They're forced to confront us. And more importantly than confronting us as people, confronting us as a concept. And so I see it even within my own family, where parents who used to be less accepting of their children and less open to their questions, they use me as their demon figure. We don't want our child to end up like Heina. So we'd better, be nicer to our kids and not be as strict, which is honestly based on a complete misconception of who I am. But if it means a better life for those kids, I'm all for it. Go ahead, misconceive me all you want. How much time do we have left? 5 minutes. All right, we got one more question then. Who has a good one? No pressure. All right, let's do gentleman in the back. Hat.
So I'm pretty ignorant And you can be a pretty straight dude and still enjoy those experiences with any party you have. But it sounds like you're explaining new concepts to me that this might be looked at a little differently in other cultures. So like pegging, is that something that isn't as, like, oh my God, I'm typical in the Muslim world because of the acknowledgement that it feels good?
So the question is, in American culture, we consider a man receiving anal sex to be emasculating and weakening and a bad thing. But, in certain Muslim cultures, it's viewed as such a pleasurable thing that you might become addicted. And so whether or not pegging is considered not as bad. Not really, no. You'd hope so, right? In my little fantasy world of how great the world could be, maybe, but not so much, no. Although there is more movement towards sex positivity within even very conservative Muslim communities. There's a woman in Egypt, I believe, she's a sexologist, and she talks about sex toys, and she has a website for Muslim couples to go on. Granted, there are no penetrative toys, because that's considered to be like a little bit not allowed. But lots of lube and sexy lingerie. Lingerie is doing giant business in the Middle East right now, by the way. That is the place to go if you want to sell a lot of lingerie. Because, these women are covered outside, but at home, in front of their husbands, often they will sex it up, So that's also happening. All right, I think we have time for one more. Go ahead. Yeah, you had your hand up.
So among ex-Muslims, how many become non-religious versus transitioning to some other religion?
The question is regarding ex-Muslims and whether they become non-religious or convert to another religion. The trend used to be, by the way, when I first Googled ex-Muslim, I think 2006 or 2007, all I found were ex-Muslim Christian websites about how Allah is wrathful and mean, but Jesus is super nice and sweet, and you should join up with him. And I'm looking at it going, I don't know, nope, I don't want to talk to these people. There was one ex-Muslim Christian on Twitter who I had to block because he would reply to every single tweet I tweeted, no matter whether or not it had to do with what he was talking about, and basically tell me that I wasn't grateful enough to white people and I should convert to Christianity to show how grateful I was to be free in the West. Then I just said, nope, no, I'm like, if you don't stop this, I'm going to block you. And it takes me a lot to block, but I ended up blocking him. But now I'd say the trend is definitely towards more moving away from religion and saying, I'm done with religion. Islam is enough religion for 10 people in one lifetime. I'm done with this. The Abrahamics all don't really like women or LGBT people in general, so I'm just going to not do that. But yeah, that's definitely been a sea change with that. But yeah, no, there are plenty of ex-Muslims who don't identify as atheists but are definitely out of religion. Do we still have time for one more? Keep saying just one more. Sure, let's just take one more. Yes.
So Catholic guilt is well known, almost a joke. And with personal experience on transitioning from Catholic to atheist and guilt that continues to follow, how have your experiences been with being Muslim and converting from I know that when you philosophically and intellectually convert, the guilt doesn't always come at the same, go away at the same time. How's your experience been with that?
So the question is regarding the sort of analogous situations of leaving Catholicism and having Catholic guilt about sexuality and leaving Islam. I honestly didn't have too much trouble with it because the only reason I had that guilt was because I had a strong belief, and once I removed the belief, that was what was holding it all together. So it all kind of fell apart. I didn't struggle so much with guilt as with identity because I'd been suppressing my queerness of various kinds for so long. I just got used to it. I didn't think about getting outside of it, and then I realized, there's no reason to suppress it anymore. And then it was overwhelming because I was dealing with how to do my hair and how to dress and all these basic life things and my life path. And so dealing with everything at once just seemed really overwhelming, so I took my time with that. I definitely am aware of ex-Muslims who have, like Catholics, kinks that have to do with their former sexuality, and they've used that to sort of over guilt, or at least play with it and provoke it deliberately. I don't really fall into that camp too much. I never really had that much guilt about it because, well, part of it is when I was Muslim, I practiced it so strictly that I didn't really have much to be guilty about. I think that's really what it was. Because a lot of Catholic guilt comes from, oh, I was Catholic and I had sex and I felt bad about it, and then I left Catholicism and I continue to feel bad about sex. Whereas I didn't even hold hands, or, you know what? Actually, I had never even shaken hands with a man from age 10 until 18. Because I hit puberty around 10 and I stopped touching men because that's not allowed in Islam. So I didn't have anything to be guilty about when I was a Muslim. So I guess I didn't have that mechanism to feel guilty about sex because I never even got close before I was a flaming atheist. All right.